Hanlon of the Brookings Institution, KT McFarland, Fox News national security analyst, Elliot Abrams, the Council of Foreign Relations, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Let's begin, Elliot, with where we are and where it may go in coming days. Your thoughts?
I think the army, which said this week, the Egyptian army, that they weren't going to fire on the demonstrators and didn't, also didn't, in a sense, fire on President Mubarak. He's still there. They're all still there. The question for the coming days is, can the army find a compromise where Mubarak stays as president theoretically but gives up his powers to Vice President Omar Suleiman, satisfy the army, satisfy Mubarak, satisfy the demonstrators and get everybody to go home? Or are they going to have next week to make the choice they've been seeking to avoid, the demonstrators or Mubarak?
KT, we hear that the Pentagon is in constant communication with the Egyptian military. Yes. How key is that, and where does the military fall in all of this?
The military is actually the key player, I think, in the entire thing. We've had a very close relationship with the American military and the Egyptian military for 30 years. Their senior officer corps, I mean, thousands of the senior Egyptian military officer corps have trained in the United States, gone to the American service academies, go to the War College, etc. And so there's a very constant, they know each other's families, they know each other intimately. I talked to a senior Pentagon official today, military official, who said that he's in close contact with the Egyptian military and that the Egyptian military are not going to fire on their people and that they will remain with the Egyptian people. So they will be the king maker or the king breaker. They don't want to be the king, but they will be the crucial swing vote in wherever this goes.
Michael, this was supposed to be the day of departure. It wasn't that violent. It was largely peaceful across the country, and there wasn't a departure.
And yet the demonstrators are still there because they realize that the minute they go home, they've lost their main power. And they don't want to trade that in for just this sort of vague talk that someday Mubarak will go. They feel that their physical power on the street needs to be translated into something more tangible before they go home. I'm not sure if that's a calculated strategy or just something they sense instinctively, but you can understand why. Because all they've got so far is sort of a paper promise, a lot of words. And to exchange that for 1 million people on the streets is a bargain they're not quite ready to make.
Do you sense, Charles, that Mubarak is really holding on here for, and how long could he do that?
I think it's only really a matter of days or weeks. I think what is really worrisome is what you reported earlier, the assassination attempt on Suleiman. The reason it's worrisome is it apparently occurred at a motorcade, a movement from one area to another, which implies that they had inside information, which means there's a breach of security, which means there are people inside the inner circles who are working against them. It also implies that there are sleeper squads. It would be hard to imagine that Suleiman is appointed on a Saturday and a squad of assassins comes in, clandestinely on a Monday. There are people, which means that what we see on the street, the demonstrators, the peaceful demonstrators, the democracy advocates are one thing. There's also a shadowy world that we didn't even know about until today, where there are real terrorists people who really mean business and who can be activated. And that may be one reason why the authorities in charge right now in Egypt are quite reluctant to relinquish power, because they know how open to attack and really destruction they might be if they relinquish what power they have.
Elliot, the senior administration official who told us about this attack, said he was surprised it hadn't been picked up by the U.S. or Egyptian press, because here's the #2 man who was almost taken out, 2 of his guards killed in a motorcade attack that they describe as organized.
Well, as Charles says, it had to be organized. Omar Suleiman has been the chief of intelligence for 19 years, so this is a tremendous breach in his personal security. But I do think that whatever happens here with Mubarak in the next few days, those 3 or 4 generals whose names we've been using, who are the sort of triumvirate, they're in charge today, really, and they're going to be in charge next week. The decision as to whether Mubarak leaves on Saturday or Monday or Wednesday is no longer Mubarak's. It's this little group of generals.
KT?
Yeah, I'm concerned that the longer this goes without some kind of a resolution, the more discredited that little group that you're talking about becomes. And, so what's in it for us? What's the United States interest in this? Certainly whatever government comes next is probably not going to be as pro-American or as ready to have a peace agreement with Israel as the current one. So what is in our interest is to figure out how to make that happen, to be the best government we can get. Now, how is that? Well, one thing that's going to happen is the longer this goes on, the more President Obama gets out and talks about, we've got to do this, you should have done it yesterday, it's now, the more impotent the United States seems, the more chaos seems to prevail, and then the weaker and the less credible that military leadership is. What's the alternative? Muslim Brotherhood chaos.
We're going to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood in depth later, Michael. This assassination attempt just raises a lot of questions about inside the government, if it's an inside job, security. It's got to be concerned not only here in Washington, but obviously in Cairo.
And the broader point I would make builds on Charles's excellent column today, which I would recommend to everyone, which is that revolutions across the world may start in a very promising way, but they are up for grabs at a certain point down the road in terms of the number of people who sense an opportunity and try to hijack that revolution for their own purposes. And one of the groups very interested in Egypt is Al-Qaeda. And so we have to wonder who will be trying to make use of this particular opportunity in this moment.